And this is the question I would always ask a potential acquisition and teams. What do you want? What do you really want? And also, what do they not want to do? We have the best crystal ball. It's called the market.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Like there is that, I mean, that, the ability to just see what's happening in real time is not a secret to anyone. So you look at some of these valuations of particularly kind of the smaller mid-cap publicly traded, they're industrials. Some are pure play defense. Others are kind of, C5 ISR, which I always thought was a very interesting acronym, but this kind of, these segments of the defense industry writ large, these are actually pretty valuable companies on a multiples basis, right? So if you come in at an early stage and you find absolutely number one, the teams, right? And the technical differentiation and just the level of excellence and the engineering, and they're addressing a product market in such a way that you can see how that the path of that company can evolve. Well, I mean, to me, it's so obvious why you would want to empower these kinds of entrepreneurs to do that, right? Particularly at their stage. Now, if your thesis is, which I've maybe some of the newer entrants into this market may have been thinking, but particularly in the later stages, it's like, oh, well, what's the next Anduril? Well, let me tell you, like, Anduril is an N of one.
I believe,
right?
I was just gonna say that, man. I don't know if that should be anybody's goal right now.
And for good reason, and absolutely, it's because of that team and its founders and the management, everyone working there. But really, it's also because of the structure of the market.
Yeah.
Right. And so, if your thesis is I'm going to find the next Anduril, well then, good luck. Right. Yeah. I mean, I hope you do. But you're going to, I think what's more likely is you can see some of these teams develop to have the optionality of, okay, maybe when we hit that mid-market level, we can partner with a bigger company.
Yeah.
Or we can actually go the distance into what is actually just another public finance. I mean, an IPO, it's just another financing. It just happens to be from a different group of investors, right? So you don't, there's all this talk around unicorns and this and that. It's like, it's so arbitrary.
It's because absolutely arbitrary. And I also think on that point, right, I think the lack of prior art on defense IPOs results in this like 180-degree range fan of perspective around what's possible. And so that's what I find is I'm talking to maybe non-thesis private capital about, the thing I hear all the time is like, oh, well, defense multiples. I'm like, well, are you talking about like an EBITDA ratio for like a defense prime? Or are you talking about like what the market will tolerate on a defense tech IPO? Because those are different things.
Right.
And I don't think the market sort of hasn't set in here's what it looks like, which makes that mid-market like way more attractive.
Very attractive. And you look at, these EBITDA, so people are like, oh, well, the big primes trade at like 3 or 4 times, earnings. It's like, no, well, okay. Well, actually 3 or 4 times, like 1 times revenue.
Yep.
Right. But you look at the earnings, especially over the last, 10, 15 years, they're actually in the low teens. Right. And if you're talking about the smaller public comps, those are mid to high teens of earnings. Now, of course, like, okay, as a startup or even a, mid-stage or late-stage private company, you're not focused on earnings, but there's proxies for that. You could see in the financials, particularly around, looking at the growth rates. So that's a very attractive exit if you get in at the right valuation.
Yeah.
Right. And so as an investor, I mean, to us, it's plain as day. And that's why we're seeing a lot of interest in, what we're doing, and I think across the broader market, I think folks for everything happening geopolitically, there's obviously that layer to it. but we don't plan for that.
Yeah.
You know, and I mean, I think it goes without saying.
An externality.
It's an externality.
Yeah.
And if anything, all of this is for deterrence, right?
Correct.
Like we hope to God that's the case. And so, but so you don't, that's not part of the calculation. And I think if investors are entering this market with that in mind, then I mean, that's an externality you can't control.
Yeah. Last question on sort of the venture side, and then I want to switch to the M&A side.
Sure.
Because I think that's a very just not, it's an under-addressed spot, especially for that sort of operating team. Sitting on both sides, right? Buy and sell side. You know, we talk about sort of the challenge with public comps of the larger sort of IPOs and defense tech and all of that. How are you seeing, you know, and I will say that, you know, the sort of new entrance into defense from a private capital standpoint, I think will have a compounding positive impact to the market. We're sort of subsidizing some new entrants coming in, assuming sort of the market does what the market should do. There's goodness in there. Do you think that there is enough sort of capital stacked up the deck and sort of taking into account how they're underwriting most of it, right? People are looking, what, 4 to 5, things like that. As you get into mid stage, right? B, C, maybe D in your sort of fundraising, and you're a defense company. Are you seeing the ladder extend that far from a capital standpoint, or does it run out around B?
Right. Well, I think that stage is highly sensitive to macro.
Yeah.
In the sense of what is the cost of capital?
Yeah.
What's the risk-free rate? Obviously now it's much higher than it was a few years ago. And at that level, you know, folks are underwriting to a broader thesis.
Yeah.
You know, when you're investing those amounts, you know, that amount of money and as part of a fund, you're underwriting to a broader industrial thesis of interest rates are going to go down, or they're going to stay the same, or they're going to go up. And that's how you're factoring those things in. You know, at the early stage, we somewhat have the luxury of not necessarily having, because again, the valuations are what they were, what we're talking about. But at the later stage, when liquidity is higher, that stuff, it just opens the door, right? And you are going to see more entrance into that. And when there's less liquidity, then it's definitely a steeper hill to climb if that's the kind of financing you want. But then on the other hand, if you've built the kind of business where you don't need to access equity financings, there's plenty of other options available. And I mean, Jamie Dimon said this, you know, a number of times where he's like, you know, with all these new banking regulations and reserve requirements, you know, I'm going to have private creditors or private lenders eat my lunch. And yes, we are seeing that in the market. There are a ton of new entrants into the private credit market where if you've built a solid business like Second Front, right, where it's like you can borrow and not have to sell parts of your company to do this when you're at a C stage or a D stage. And that could work out very nicely.
Yeah. That optionality is pretty unheard of in recent history.
Right. Right. And lending wasn't even that, it was just not that attractive for some of these private pools of capital because the rates were less. So it's, you know, there's always a trade-off. Yeah. Right. And that's how you optimize. I mean, that's what we talk about with our portfolio companies is what are the trades? Right. So
flip that, right? We talk about sort of the private capital markets. Talking about, and you've heard me talk about this a bunch. I've talked about with like James Cross and the team at Silicon Valley Defense Group is, hey, like, what's that thesis on mid-market M&A that, you know, one, looking at that as a positive outcome for founders, right? Because that's capability creation, that's capability transfer. So that's a net win for national security in the country.
100%.
The economics should be in place if you've done it right, that could also be very, very interesting. How are you seeing, one, sort of that market starts to take shape with all the new entrants of sort of the ISVs and these sort of defense tech companies? And then conversely, you know, you use the sort of you at Andrew, you can look at, you know, APP there now, sort of doing big sort of roll-ups. I think I'm starting to see some of that trickle down, and you're seeing conversations earlier at company sort of operating teams around, hey, all right, like maybe next round will be, we'll bring money in and we'll go do a couple roll-ups, sort of either buy down capability development risk, buy into sort of TAM expansion. Are you seeing sort of M&A, I guess, like I said, on the sell side, be interested there. But on the buy side at the company level, what are you seeing in there too?
Right. Yeah. I mean, my framework for this, again, I mean, I'm a Marine, right? So pretty simplistic.
Primary colors only.
Absolutely. So it's about filling gaps.
Yeah.
Right. It's about this is the question I would always ask a potential acquisition and teams. Like, what do you want?
Yeah.
What do you really want? And if you ask that enough times and enough ways, you get to like, well, what do they want to do? And also, what do they not want to do? Right. And some of the acquisitions I've been involved in, and that I could see, happen in, over the course of our fund and others is one great example is it's a technical founder who has built an incredible product, has made a number of very interesting engineering innovations, what have you. And you know what they don't want to do? They don't want to do HR.
Yeah.
Right. They don't want to do G&A. They want to keep building. And that could be that's a very good gap for a potential acquirer to fill.